I think they would leave that civilian population in place. In fact, probably welcome it if it came back. They're not interested in permanent hostility with the Ukrainian people per se. They are very sensitive to what happens in Western Ukraine. I have had Russians tell me, some in uniform, this is within the last few years, that they thought that the best solution was for the Poles to move into Western Ukraine because within a very short period of time, there would be a Polish-Ukrainian war. And then the Russians would have less to worry about because the Ukrainians hate the Poles. And the Ukrainians hate a lot of people, not just Russians, all sorts of people. And the Poles have had their eye on that area. They ruled it for hundreds of years, obviously, but they've also had bad experiences. It was ultimately the Cossack rebellions that weakened Poland so much that it had to ultimately vanish from the map because it couldn't rule itself. So, the Russians know the history, and you're absolutely right. There is no interest in going into Western Ukraine under any circumstances. So the notion that was ever on anybody's mind is just nonsense. In fact, I think they would be very grateful if the Poles, the Slovaks, the Hungarians, the people in Moldova and Romania would all sit down and say, look, let's sort this thing out. Let's come to some sort of agreement. And I think that could happen ultimately. But unfortunately, at the moment, we're making that impossible. You heard the announcement from Chancellor Merz, who now says there are no restrictions on the use of these strike weapons with a range of 300 miles or 500 kilometers. Well, this puts the Russians in a very difficult position. They made it clear this is unacceptable. So the question now is, how much do they put up with before Chancellor Merz wakes up in the middle of the night with a missile in his bedroom? And people don't think that's possible. They're wrong. The Russians have just about had it with this German government. And the Russians do not necessarily understand how this government can behave as it does when the overwhelming majority of Germans want nothing to do with this war in Ukraine, just as the overwhelming majority of Poles want nothing to do with it. They've been waiting for these people to change their governments. I know that for a fact. They've said clearly, give these people time. They'll put somebody else in power who makes sense, but it hasn't happened yet.
The problem is that even if you have 80, 85, 90% of the population against the war with Russia, if you manage to bait Russia into firing the first shots, then you will have that war. I mean, that's what happened to Ukraine. That's how they got this mass mobilization and so on. This is how the neocon factions managed to get the war going in the first place, by having the other side firing, like crossing the first big border, right? And moving in. But the Europeans, Colonel, I listened again to one of these very popular talk shows in Germany. They still, to this date, argue that, oh, we cannot reward Russia with territories. Reward. They use the word reward. Still, after 3 years, they think it's a reward that Russia is winning the war. Can you, I don't want to raise your blood pressure, but can you talk to that a little bit? Where and when, what would it take for the Europeans, especially the Germans, for this to sink in that this is not a reward? This is the bloody outcome of a bloody, horrible war, the way that Berlin was not a reward in 45.
Oh, that's right. No, this is a de facto recognition of what exists that is not reversible at this stage, or should be, frankly, given Russia's interests. I think, and I have a lot of friends in Germany, and I do talk to them, as you know, and they tell me there has been a sea change in public opinion in Germany. That, first of all, the Germans are sick of all the foreigners they have in their country, not just Muslims. They're also sick of the Ukrainians who are in Germany, just as the Poles are sick of the 3 million Ukrainians in their country. A lot of people don't know it, but this is an interesting side. When the Ukrainians in Poland were asked what language they wanted their children to be instructed in, they all said Russian. The Germans are looking at this, and the average German on the street is, we're kind of fed up and disgusted with this. Now, what you're saying is that if Merz ends up with a missile in his bedroom, that the entire German nation is going to suddenly mobilize, equip, and march east. No, I don't see it. First of all, These military establishments in Europe, particularly in Western Europe, are so backward. They are so complacent. Their discipline is so poor. It would take a decade to recover from the current state of their armed forces. Now, they can certainly build missiles and rockets, but then again, you're just exchanging with the Russians. Look at the size of Russia, look at the size of Germany. That's going to be a short exchange. I don't see the Germans doing that. I think the Germans are increasingly dissatisfied with Merz and everybody else. And the interesting thing is that this has been wonderful for the Alternative für Deutschland. The AfD has benefited enormously from it, but they're also continually excluded from the policy process. They're kept out of everything. So if you look at this, it's kind of National Socialism in reverse. You've got this dictatorial regime in Berlin that wants to pursue policies that are fundamentally antithetical to the interests of the German nation, and they remain in power. And the one party that is absolutely opposed to war with Russia, it's opposed to deindustrialization, it's opposed to the destruction of the German economy, and it has recognized the futility and stupidity of trying to build an armed force right now to fight Russia. But they can't get into the policymaking process. Now, will this last forever? No, I don't think so. And I think what will happen is they will eventually gain power. But in the meantime, if the German people have any say in anything, and I think they would in the case of going to war with Russia, they would oppose it, especially since we've made it clear. And this is the other strange phenomenon. You have, on the one hand, Trump adopting the bellicose language, making these statements that have no bearing on reality, things that he rejected 120 days ago, 180 days ago. He wouldn't have said any of them. Now he's saying them, essentially repeating this sort of neocon globalist narrative about Russia. He's also saying he wants to get out of Germany. He wants to withdraw forces from Germany. Well, if you're a German and you say, well, the Americans want to get out.
Do you think he's
And
serious about that? I just can't
yes,
imagine it. You think he's serious?
look, one of the things in private conversation with him in November of 2020, he made it abundantly clear that he was deadly serious. And that wasn't the first time. He has long felt that the Europeans should be their own first responders. President Trump is not a fool. He understands, just as Eisenhower did in the 1950s, there will be no new Normandy invasion. It's not going to happen. We're not coming back with millions of troops. We can't do it. The technology of warfare has changed. And if we're going to send anything to anybody that's meaningful, it has to go by sea. And today, any convoy that crosses the Atlantic or the Pacific with large quantities of troops and materiel is going to be identified and ultimately destroyed, either by ground-based or air-launched precision missile strikes or by submarines. So it's over. And he knows it's over. The Europeans are in denial. They don't want to accept that, but they've got to come to terms with it.
I'm asking this because, the US strategy of having military bases all around the world, to me, doesn't seem to be changing, because taking the forces out of Germany would be huge, because a lot of the US command, also AFRICOM and so on, is stationed in Germany, right? It would be much easier to start, let's say, in Finland and Sweden, which only last year got base agreements with the US, right? He could cancel those, but those are 15 and 17 US bases each. That's over 30 new bases in the Nordics. That would be much easier to cancel, but I don't hear any of that talk.
No, and you're right. First of all, and this is very important to understand, most Europeans cannot grasp this, and they need to get this. There is no strategy. None. The only thing that people want to do in Washington is to hold on to what exists. In other words, they are clinging tenaciously to the status quo, even though everybody privately knows we can't afford it. We can't maintain it. We can't sustain it. It's kind of funny. People talk about $1 trillion defense budget, but at the same time, everybody sees what's happening in Japan and the collapse of the bond market. That's going to happen here. We're at roughly 4.5% on 10-year treasuries. Each month, this goes up a few points. At some point, it's going to rise quickly in a way that we cannot possibly imagine today, but it will, because we no longer have control. You can cut the interest rates, and the yield for Treasury bonds goes up anyway, because people don't want to invest in us. We have been selling 2-year Treasuries. Even that is now going to become a problem. Nobody wants to buy the 30 years anymore. And now we have the Japanese who've told us, look, we're in a lot of trouble. No hard feelings, but we're going to dump your treasuries. We're going to get rid of them. They're not worth anything. The Chinese are going to do it. And they are the last ones. People don't understand this. Chinese don't want to become the reserve currency. They're very happy to let us do it. They always have been. This is another myth, the evil China that wants to conquer the world and rule Asia. If the Chinese truly wanted to rule Asia, there's an organization, it's called Tokyo. They'd have something to say about it. It's not going to happen. And the Vietnamese would never tolerate it either. And the last time the Chinese challenged the Vietnamese, that was a very unsatisfactory outcome. Look, we're living on Fantasy Island in Washington. Washington, D.C. is Fantasy Island. We can't afford any of it. We've spent ourselves into oblivion. We're headed into a severe recession that could become a depression, particularly if we end up in a war in the Middle East, which we haven't talked about. That would trigger catastrophe over here. We continue to lose control of industries. We just sold the last semblance of national power in the form of United States Steel to Japan. I mean, nobody that I knew when I was living in the 50s and 60s, if I told them the Japanese are going to buy U.S. steel, people would say it's impossible. You've lost your mind. We are in bad shape, Pascal. That's the truth.
So is the United States, pretending to be a jet fighter when it's actually more of a very big hot air balloon, and something's going to give at some point?
Oh, absolutely. Everybody should understand something. When did the British leave India? The British left India 1947, 1948, when the debt to GDP ratio in Great Britain was 240%. Now, remember, if you go back to the 30s and you look at the British General Staff Journal and the discussions that were held with politicians, what was the number one priority for the British? Was it defending France against the Germans? No, it was the empire, and it was India. And in fact, there was tremendous resistance to what Churchill wanted to do because they kept pointing to Stalin and the Soviets and say, that's the real enemy. What are you doing? We're not going to benefit from destroying the Nazi regime if it's replaced by the Soviets. Well, we all know the rest of the story. In the meantime, everything that they insisted they were fighting for, what happened to it? It went away. When things get bad here, the first thing we will do is cut forces overseas and bring them home. It's much cheaper to maintain the forces here than it is to maintain them overseas.
I mean, honestly, I would hope for this to happen, because that would, in my view, de-escalate a lot of situations. Maybe not everywhere. The one place that will always try to intervene as much as it can politically to prevent that from happening is Israel. What do you think is Israel's role in the let's say the scaling back of the U.S. empire?
Well, keep in mind, before we leave the topic of troop withdrawals, that the Washington just announced, the Trump administration, their intention to withdraw 5,000 troops from the Korean Peninsula.
Right.
Now, we've kept all these forces in Korea and Japan because of the imminent threat from China. All of a sudden, we say, well, we don't need to do that. The problem is, what I'm trying to get across is there is no strategy. First of all, before you withdraw troops, you sit down with your allies and you come up with a plan to withdraw. You be honest and straightforward and say, look, we can't stay here in the numbers we have. We have to cut costs. We're going to have to make withdrawals. And you work it out. You should work it out with the Germans, with the Italians. You mentioned the Swedes and the Finns that have apparently bet the farm on the arrival of U.S. forces, which is sheer lunacy. But the point is, I don't see any strategy. No one is in Tokyo or Seoul and saying, look, we want to coordinate these withdrawals. We're just going to start leaving. and we're going to try and do it in the dead of night.
Indeed, the thing is, the Japanese and the Koreans, just like the Germans and the Europeans in general, they try to do the opposite. They cling to the Americans, right? They don't want to let them go. And the Korean situation is interesting because there's a joint staff agreement. In fact, if ever North Korea crosses the 38th parallel, the person in charge, the general in charge of both of U.S. and Korean forces would be a U.S. general. The U.S. general would command the Korean forces as well. And that agreement is still in place. I know that the U.S. and Korea were talking about changing that, but it's still in place at the moment. They're just so tightly intertwined, especially over here in Asia.
Well, things are changing. In my book, Breaking the Phalanx, I recommended in 1997, when that book came out, that a Korean four-star should command all of the forces on the peninsula, not an American. We're down to roughly 23,000 in the Army and another 6,000 or so Navy and Air Force. It's a very small contingent. We are no longer on the border between the two Koreas. The South Korean military is excellent. It's more than adequate to defend itself. And to be frank with you, the majority of anybody that you talk to that has any sort of understanding strategically of the region does not expect North Korea to attack South Korea. In fact, they're developing very good rapport with Beijing, and the last thing that Beijing wants is a war on the Korean Peninsula.
And North
Well,
Korea, last year, Kim Jong-un said, we know where our southern border is. We don't want the south. We know where the border is. They actually kind of renounced their claim to South Korea.
but the thing is, we need to talk to them, because I can tell you that in North Korea, if they see a sudden evacuation of U.S. forces from South Korea, they'll believe that a nuclear strike by the United States against them is imminent. Now, that may seem strange to you and me, but you have to understand the North Korean mentality that has evolved there over many decades. So what you want is some sort of agreement in place that gradually disengages us in a way that is very understandable, very obvious, and widely monitored by both North and South. You need to talk to the president of China. He has a stake in all of this. You need to talk to Tokyo. Let me stop for a minute and give you an example of what I'm talking about. When Nixon went to China with Kissinger, after they had had their discussions and signed their agreements and so forth, Deng Xiaoping turned to Kissinger and he said, "Have you been to Tokyo? Have you told the Japanese what you're doing?" Believe it or not, the answer was no. Deng Xiaoping said, "You should talk to the Japanese. We know them very well. They have an interest in what is happening, and you should talk to them, keep them informed, keep them on board. We, China, want good relations with the Japanese." So my point is, this is pure American stupidity. Okay, we are governed by arrogance and ignorance. We are effusive in praise for ourselves. We see ourselves in unrealistic ways. All you have to do is listen to President Trump. If they're not going to do what I say, if they're not going to come together, well, then I'm not going to have anything to do with this. We'll walk away. Who the hell does he think he is? Who does he think he's dealing with? We have no true sense of a balance regarding who we are and who others are. And this is dangerous. And it's very dangerous for the Europeans. The bad news is it sounds like Merz, Macron, and Starmer have contracted a similar disease. They don't realize what they're dealing with. I can't imagine Palmerston in England or Disraeli or Gladstone or anybody else treating the Russians with this same kind of disregard and contempt. They understand very well that Russia may be many things, but Russia is a great power, and it has enormous influence. You don't treat it badly, but we do. We treat other countries badly, and we think everyone should bow down to us. So I just want to get that across before we go into the Middle East, because these are things Europeans must understand about us. Keep in mind, I love my country, and I think Americans have many fine attributes, but we're talking about a government, not the American people. We're talking about a government with an unrealistic view of itself and the rest of the world. Remember, it's Fantasy Island. Nobody know. Well, I mentioned the Cossack Rebellion. If you mention that on the Hill, people look at you and say, what? Oh, you mean these funny guys that wear funny hats and ride horses? I mean, that's the level of ignorance. Uh, this country is a planet on its own, literally. Europeans need to understand that, and they need to get a hold of people like Rubio and the State Department and others and say, look, talk to us. What are you really doing? Nobody really knows. Trump has just made it a number of contradictory statements, reversed himself completely, 180-degree turns from where he was a couple of months ago. And everybody acts like, well, that's no big deal. It's a very big deal. We need to get on board with the rest of the world.
No, you're right. And the scary thing is that we tend to think that policies and so on are made in boardrooms, meeting rooms, and delivered over, and plans and generals and so on. But we now understand, no, it's WhatsApp chat groups, and it's ad hoc, and it deals with what the day throws at you, and especially these pronouncements by Mr. Trump. They're made at the whim of his fingers, right? And they have like market impact, they have geopolitical impact, and that's something the rest of the world just needs to deal with. Um, but let's talk just for a few minutes about the Middle East, because the most important negotiations there are, of course, with Iran in order to avoid a war there. And I would say avoid a war that wasn't even, I mean, you wouldn't even have needed to threaten that, but it's in the room, right? The 60 days, and I think they have passed now. They surely have passed. But what do you see happening in these negotiations with Iran and the issue with Israel?
Well, keep in mind that President Trump's envoy, also to Moscow, but more recently to Iran and in the Middle East, has been his golfing buddy and real estate mogul, Mr. Witkoff. Mr. Witkoff, after talking to the Iranians, by the way, after talking to the Russians, we thought we were on the road to normalizing relations with Russia. That's all gone away suddenly. We thought that we were on the road back to something similar to the JCPOA that was established under the Obama administration with Iran. It turns out that that was unacceptable to Mr. Netanyahu. And suddenly we changed our position and said there can be no enrichment of uranium of any kind under any circumstances. Well, that's a deal killer. You can't come to any arrangement with the Iranians. Recently, the Pakistani foreign minister said Iran has the right to enrich uranium. Nobody disputes that, and that cannot be part of a deal. Well, obviously, the Pakistanis have their own nuclear weapons, and so do the Indians, and others have looked at this, and they know Israel is well armed with nuclear weapons, and so their view is you can't exclude this from any arrangement with Iran. And I think the other thing that came up, of course, is the ballistic missile arsenal. Mr. Netanyahu wanted limits on those ranges. And of course, Mr. Netanyahu said in the Oval Office what he really wants is the Libyan solution for Iran. I don't think his opinion has changed. And it's important that everyone keep in mind that Mr. Netanyahu currently has far more influence in the Senate and the House in the United States over what they do, what they vote for, and what they think than Mr. Trump does.
It's very sad. But I mean, looking at the number of standing ovations, yes, yes.
And Gaza has gone almost completely unnoticed in the United States. If you bring it up, well, you're obviously an anti-Semite. If you suggest that the United States should not support a program of mass murder and expulsion of people from Gaza, or for that matter, the West Bank, which is also on the agenda, you don't know what you're talking about, and you must be an anti-Semite. It was surprising to me after all of this time that the German government finally woke up and said this is unacceptable to us. They've been on the apology tour for 80 years, and it's been very difficult for them to take any position which was critical of Israel. Finally, they've acknowledged this is wrong. I don't see that happening anytime soon in the United States. So I think Right now, it's hard to predict with certainty, but I think we're still on the path to conflict with Iran. Now, you'll probably say, how does that happen? And we can talk about that if you want to.
I mean, we have let's take 4 or 5 more minutes because I don't want to keep you too long. But like from a military perspective, I would argue a war scenario with Iran is a worst case scenario also for the United States. I mean, it's a nightmare, no, like a logistical and military nightmare.
Well, you have to understand how people view conflict with Iran in Washington. The first thing they'll tell you is there will be no ground force involved. Well, that's true. We have none to send. Our army is pitifully small. It's in no condition to mount a major offensive on the ground anywhere in the world right now. The Marine Corps, which is usually used to extend or expand the army, is in no position to augment the army. It's gone through profound changes. It simply could not fight in this high intensity conventional environment. So there will be no ground forces. That's the argument. And so the question is, what are you trying to achieve? And the two things that they want to talk about is number one, they want to destroy Iran's capacity to enrich uranium. In other words, its nuclear underground development site. And number two, they will tell you, we really need to go after that regime. That's the problem. The Iranian people are ready to rebel against it. If we destroy the regime, the Iranians will take care of the rest. And they're convinced that if they use the munitions, conventional, that have been developed by the Air Force, these enormous, megaton bombs with conventional explosives that are designed to penetrate and do enormous damage, as we've seen for instance, in Beirut when they killed the leader of Hezbollah. Those munitions can be used, and they think they will be successful. So that's the way they view it. And then they say, we have to add to all of this, obviously, the fleet and the rest of the Air Force, so we can destroy their integrated air defenses. And when you say, well, are you sure about that? And do you think you can actually penetrate deeply into their airspace and deliver these munitions? Oh, of course. Absolutely. So I think there is a great deal of confidence in the supremacy of the United States Air Force and the United States Navy's Air Force and missile arsenal. And they think they can achieve that outcome. Now, right now, it's pretty clear that President Trump does not want war with Iran. When I talked to him at the same time we were discussing withdrawing forces from Germany, it was very clear to me he didn't want a war with Iran. This is not someone who wants war. Well, that's fine. Then you need to prevent it. And at this point, he's not in a position to do so. Because if Mr. Netanyahu, one way or another, starts the war and ends up flying against Iranian air defenses and delivering whatever munitions he has, and he has virtually everything that we do at this point, or even worst case, decides to use a low-yield nuclear weapon to destroy the site, which I think would be a catastrophic error, but it's on the table for the Israelis, we would inevitably be dragged into this on their side. And that goes back to the control and influence that he has on the Hill. And all you have to do is listen to the people on the Hill. Listen to these senators speak.
Yeah.
Did you hear this man Kennedy, Senator Kennedy from Louisiana, who said, I think Mr. Trump has been dishonored and insulted by Mr. Putin. I think we should turn Russia into fish food. Please stop and think about that. It's a statement of incalculable stupidity and ignorance, but that passes for serious thinking on the Hill. Look at Lindsey Graham. Go down the whole list of senators, and it's not just Republicans. There are plenty of Democrats who agree. This is the uniparty. The uniparty supports war. So I don't think he can avoid it if it gets started. He'll have to become involved.
Yeah, and sadly enough, Israel could nuke Iran tomorrow, claim self-defense, and if Iran answers, the United States would say it's unacceptable. I mean, that's the level to where we got at the moment with the impunity for Israel, and this is wreaking havoc. Colonel, people who want to follow you on your writing, where should they go?
Well, there's lots of things on YouTube. You can find me there. I'm on a lot of people's podcasts. I'm no longer with Our Country, Our Choice, but I am still on the advisory board. But you're not going to find my work there very much. I think I've written 5 books, and the number you Google my name, and I've written over the years so many things that have addressed a lot of these items. I get tired of talking about it. The one, so put the name in and make sure you spell it right. That means MAC, small Gregor. You'll find just about anything you need. Now, the one last thing I would say, and this is very important to the Europeans, do not assume what I described will be contained within the Middle East. The Russians, the Chinese, others, Pakistan, India, all of these people have an interest in what happens. And the Russians in particular are not going to allow us to pulverize Iran into submission. I don't think the Chinese will either. And again, that's why when you look at what are the ramifications, implications, the Egyptians that have sat on the border quietly will no longer sit on the border quietly. They will attack. Even the Jordanians, who had the most to lose because they're the least stable, they would attack. And then the real question is, what do the Turks do? The Turks have played along. You saw Mr. Trump go to the Middle East. You saw him compliment Mr. Gilani, the former head or deputy head of ISIS, and tell everybody he's a fine young man, very attractive young man. Why did he do that? Because Mr. Gilani reports to Mr. Erdogan in Turkey. Without the Turkish involvement in the destruction of the Assad regime, nothing over there would have changed. Right now, what he's trying to do is hold together this Turkish-Israeli cooperative alliance because he's trying to ensure that they attain hegemony over the region. Well, that may not work because the Turks take a different view of their relationship with Israel right now. And that relationship could change as suddenly as the Nazi-Soviet relationship changed in June of 1941.
Yeah.
So all of these things need to be kept in mind. And we haven't even talked about the situation here at home. We still have enormous problems. We have 50 plus million illegals. Criminality is still out of control. Our borders are not completely secure. We're still seeing human and drug trafficking pouring through the legal ports of entry on the borders with Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and California. Things are not good here. Okay. Our societal cohesion is not strong. But you never know it on Fantasy Island. On Fantasy Island, everything is fine. Everything is wonderful. And we are the invincible, invulnerable superpower.